Hello, and welcome to a Rodent's guide on the Chaos Legionaries in Kill Team 2024. This video will serve as a general introduction to the Chaos Legionaries kill team, as well as a specialist video for those that have played the team before. Like always, there will be timestamps in the description below to help you navigate this guide. It does include any changes to the team as a result of the first balanced data slate that dropped on 29 January 2025. My name is Mouse. Let's get into the video. The Legionaries team has been faithfully transferred over from KT21. It remains a 6-model elite team with many specialist models and a basic warrior profile. Several of these specialists will be staples of the team, but multiple slots on the squad can be adjusted depending on your opponent and the board layout. In general, each model is impactful and brings a lot of good things to the team. Before we talk operatives, let's run through some of the faction rules for the Legionaries kill team. The primary faction rule for the team are the Marks of Chaos, which provide both a constant minor buff to each operative and allow various ploys to enhance them further in a pinch. Unlike last edition, these marks can be reassigned every game, even in tournament play, which grants the team a lot of flexibility and ensures that they always have the tools they need in every matchup. Each operative on the team must have a mark assigned to it, and the only operative that has a mark restriction is the Balefire Acolyte, who cannot be given the Mark of Khorne. First up, the Mark of Khorne gives all melee weapons for the operative the Severe Weapon rule. The Mark of Nurgle gives that operative a 5-up to reduce normal damage received by 1 every time it takes 3 or more damage. The Mark of Slaanesh grants 1 additional inch to the operative's move stat. The Mark of Tzeentch gives all ranged weapons for the operative the Severe Weapon rule, similar to the Mark of Khorne. And finally, the Undivided Mark gives an operative ceaseless if it is fighting, retaliating, or shooting at an enemy operative within 6 inches of it. On top of the Marks of Chaos, each operative for this kill team is a Fallen Astartes, giving them the ability to fight twice or shoot twice each time that they activate. Shooting twice can only be done if one of the shoot actions is done using a bolt pistol, bolt gun, or tainted bolt pistol, but each legionary operative can counteract regardless of its order. We'll talk more about strategies related to team composition later in the video, so now let's look at the operatives that are available to the legionary kill team. There are 2 leader options for this team, the Aspiring Champion and the Chosen. Talking about the Aspiring Champion first, they can be equipped with either a plasma pistol or a tainted bolt pistol for their ranged weapon, and a host of available melee options. The plasma pistol was the auto take last edition, but now that plasma weapons are a little bit weaker, the standard pistol option for this leader is going to be the tainted bolt pistol. If you select this operative to have the Mark of Tzeentch, you can guarantee at least 1 critical hit because of Severe, which then converts a normal hit into a second critical every time that you shoot. And because this guy can shoot twice each activation, he's reliably threatening lots of damage at that medium range that pistols have. As for his melee weapon, this should be catered to your opponent's standard wound count. Each has their merits, so let's quickly talk about the 2 usual suspects. The Power Fist having 7 damage on a critical is important against standard enemy humans, or Eldari enemies if you want to take the leader as the Mark of Khorne. Skipping ahead slightly, there's a ploy for this team that gives all Khorne operatives +1 damage to normal and critical strikes in melee, so you can reliably deal 8 damage with a single critical hit using a Power Fist. The other common weapon loadout is the Power Weapon, which is more reliable by hitting on 3s and deals 4-6 damage with lethal 5-up. Again, if you take the leader with the Mark of Khorne, you can jump this damage profile to 5-7, which importantly will 2-shot Phobos opponents and can kill other elite Space Marines in 3 normal hits. This second weapon loadout acts as a pretty tough stat check for many teams and is one of the things that makes the Legionary kill team so good right now. Okay, enough about weapon options. The Aspiring Champion has 1 ability, called In the Eyes of the Gods. Once during each of this operative's activations, if it incapacitates an enemy operative, add 1 to its APL stat until the end of that activation. Depending on the opponent, this can trigger pretty consistently, giving you access to lots of downrange threat for the opponent. This operative can easily get himself 3 kills in a single activation by charging into an enemy or 2, fighting them, and then spending their remaining APL shooting into other nearby targets. The second available leader option is the Chosen, who has a more limited weapon selection than the Aspiring Champion, but really just gets the best of both worlds from those 2 choices that we talked about earlier. The Demon Blade is still 5 attacks and hits on 3s, but does 4-7 damage and has lethal 5-up. This means that it hits the same breakpoints that we discussed earlier for the Power Fist, and the same upsides as the power weapon with accuracy and critical reliability. All of the points from the Aspiring Champion apply here too. The difference for this option are his two abilities, Demonic Aura and Soul Gorge. Demonic Aura allows you to roll a d6 every time an enemy operative tries to fall back from you, and on a 3-up, that enemy is unable to fall back during the activation, but their APL is refunded. Most of the time, operatives aren't going to be surviving long enough to fall back from this guy, but it is a way to trap enemies in combat and prevent their friends from shooting you. Soul Gorge states that after this operative fights or retaliates, if it isn't incapacitated, but it incapacitated an enemy operative during that sequence, this operative regains up to D3 plus 1 lost wounds. This cannot overheal our guy, but it's a nice way to keep the tank topped off as we barrel into the enemy lines. Just remember that you have to kill the target in order for this to apply. Between the two leader options, the choice usually comes down to what you're facing across the table, which is going to be a theme for this team. If you reliably think that you can one-shot their models, and or the mission that you're playing for the game requires you to perform an action, consider taking the Aspiring Champion. That 4th APL that they can have access to can be a really powerful tool if you are able to get value out of it. You just don't want to end up in positions where getting that 4th APL kind of just goes to waste. If you are fighting into tougher enemy operatives, such as other elite teams, or if you're worried about being chipped down through combat with lots of enemy in melee, consider the Chosen for their more consistent damage profile and better sustain through their self-healing after kills. The rest of the team consists of 5 operatives that can come from a variety of specialists or the standard warrior option. First up on this list is the Anointed, who is easily my favorite unit on the squad. This monster is the point of the spear for the squad, acting like a live grenade and jumping into enemy lines at the earliest opportunity. They can dish out some serious melee damage thanks to their only ability, Unleash Demon. Once per battle, when this operative is activated, you can choose to grant this operative a variety of buffs until the end of the game, but you cannot undo this action. This operative loses the ability to perform pick-up marker actions or mission actions, except for opening doors on ITD, and it immediately drops a marker if it is holding one when this action occurs. It's worth it though, because then they reduce damage by 1 from all sources if they take 4 or more damage, but it doesn't stack with the Mark of Nurgle damage reduction that we talked about for their mark. Also, their melee weapon gains Ceaseless and Lethal 5-up, which increases their damage output pretty significantly. I've never not taken this operative into a battle, and he's always able to tangle with the scariest melee operatives that my opponent can send his way. Between the damage reduction and the devastating melee upgrade, this operative loves to crash into enemy lines and draw out their big weapons that have to deal with him. He's usually able to take at least one of them down with him, and gives the rest of our squad good shots on other high-value targets. Next up, the Balefire Acolyte, who is this team's lone Psyker operative. They have 2 ranged spells, one which has a 2-inch blast, and the other that can heal an operative visible and within 6 inches of the Balefire Acolyte, which includes themselves. This unit can be surprisingly painful for your opponents to have to deal with, and the Siphon Life ability on their spell and dagger can make them really hard to chip down with small arms fire. I would especially consider bringing this guy along if your opponent's team requires them to bunch up, or you're playing on a map like ITD where grouping up is inevitable. Their blast spell doesn't have heavy, so they can cover a lot of ground with a repossession and a dash to get that perfect angle and fry multiple targets. Just remember that you can't cast both spells in a single activation, because the Astartes faction rule requires that one of your shooting actions has to use their bolt pistol. The Butcher is up next, and oh man, I wish this guy could see some more love. Thematically, this operative is awesome, but on the tabletop he can feel kind of unwieldy. As you would think from looking at him, he does one thing: go forward. The downside is that although he has 5 attacks, he hits on 4s and doesn't have access to rerolls. There aren't any ploys or other abilities on the team that you can use to give him rerolls either, other than the standard command point reroll, which pretty much makes this guy scary for you to send in and fight. You kind of just have to hope that he gets the job done. The upside is that if you give him the Mark of Khorne, you can buff him up to always having an 8 damage critical on hand, which in itself can just one-shot some opponents and you don't have to worry about the rerolls. Like the Balefire Acolyte, I would consider taking him on maps where your opponent is going to have to group up because of his devastating Onslaught ability. First, it says that enemy operatives cannot assist each other when in combat against this operative. Second, and more importantly, at the end of every enemy activation or counteraction, you can select one enemy operative within 2 inches of this operative. This operative can perform a free charge action, and you can change your order to engage to do this, but it cannot move more than 2 inches, and it must end that move within control range of the selected operative. If your opponent doesn't see this coming, or you are able to position yourself just right, this ability can really escalate things for your opponent in a hurry. It'll pay off with practice, but this operative can easily charge into 2 enemies, kill both of them, only to then charge into a third enemy if they're really close, and potentially counteract to fight them and kill a third operative in just that single turn. This operative still also comes with all of the upsides of being an elite Space Marine, so he can be very challenging to bring down. Just remember that not all matchups are going to be reasonable to bring this guy. He really doesn't do well if he can't one-shot his targets, he doesn't really have any abilities if your opponent can space their operatives out appropriately, and he doesn't do great when he's not the one that's starting the fights. The Legionary Gunner operative has 3 weapon choices, but in 3rd edition Kill Team, the default weapon option is pretty much always going to be that Melt-A-Gun. Oddly enough, if the Melt-A-Gun wouldn't be good in a particular matchup, like Void Dancer Troop or Mandrakes, who can just ignore the piercing weapon roll, you just don't take a Gunner operative at all. Make no mistake, the Melt-A-Gun is a vicious weapon that can easily overtake a game and defeat whatever your opponent challenges your positions with. Their reliable shooting profile of 4 attacks hitting on 3s is standard Space Marine shooting, but the damage of 6-7 is extremely powerful. Taking this operative with the Mark of Tzeentch guarantees that you'll get at least 1 critical from that severe weapon roll, and you can buff their shooting further if you spend for a ploy, which we'll talk about later. The Plasma Gun can be a decent option if you're interested in getting into long-range firefights with the enemy, but you're generally better suited to just moving up the board and evaporating targets with the crazy damage output of the Melt-A-Gun. It takes a little bit of a mindset shift to work with that 6-inch range instead of having a full-range plasma, but trust me, it's worth getting used to. The Heavy Gunner has 2 primary weapon choices, but even that really boils down to 1 choice if you're trying to maximize their lethality. The Heavy Bolter and the Reaper Chain Cannon do about the same damage when firing a single time and with the Mark of Tzeentch. But the Heavy Bolter gets a proportionately better upgrade from the Tzeentch shooting ploy, which again we'll talk about later. Just know that if you want to be shooting targets and they take a little bit more firepower to bring down, like other Space Marines, you'll want to take the Heavy Bolter. You might be able to set up some nasty 2-inch torrent situations with the Reaper Chain Cannon though, so don't be afraid to try it out. The Chain Cannon is also a gorgeous weapon model, so I highly encourage you build it and just tell your opponent that you're running it as a Heavy Bolter if that becomes relevant. No one's going to care, really, unless you're at a hardcore tournament, and even then hit up the TOs, because it might not matter. Sadly, the Missile Launcher option here does about the same damage as the other 2 options, but doesn't have the ability to hit multiple targets with the high damage option. This operative can be hard to take if your opponent has good melee threats, or is smart about positioning safely to advance up the board, so keep that in mind when you're thinking about taking a Heavy Gunner. The Icon Bearer is a staple of the team, but they've recently been toned down from their craziness at the beginning of the edition. Now, this operative has 2 abilities. 1, they count as being +1 APL when determining the control of a marker, which helps them to hold on to objectives as a 4 APL powerhouse, and then they also have the Favored of the Dark Gods ability. This allows them, in the Ready Operatives step of each strategy phase, to taint an objective marker on the battlefield that hasn't already been tainted by either side. This operative must control that objective marker, and if you choose to do so, you gain 1 CP. This is much more reasonable as a version of this ability than what previously existed, but it means that you'll have to employ some strategy about positioning this operative and moving them up the board. I typically have them situated to reach my side's home objective with a reposition and a dash in the first turning point so that they can taint it at the beginning of turn 2 and then move to contest one of the other 2 objectives for the remainder of the game. I take this operative with a chainsword and bolt pistol to threaten nearly all operatives in the game, and if I really need the extra damage for those important breakpoints, you can take them with the Mark of Khorne to get a 5-6 melee weapon with 5 attacks and hitting on 3s. It's pretty scary stuff, and you know the enemy has to come to you since you're going to be standing on their objectives to taint them and get that extra CP. The Shrive Talon is another melee specialist, but one with some utility available to the kit as well. First, their ability Vicious Reflexes allows you to resolve the first attack die if this operative is retaliating, making it really hard to effectively trade with this guy through chip damage. Their second ability, Horrifying Dismemberment, says that whenever this operative incapacitates an enemy operative while fighting or retaliating, you can select one other enemy operative visible to and within 3 inches of either this guy or the guy who was killed. You can subtract 1 from that enemy operative's APL stat until the end of their next activation. This niche ability allows you to really disrupt the action economy of enemy operatives, potentially stopping their return punch entirely if you drop a 2 APL model down to just a single available action. The big utility piece of the Shrive Talon, however, is their Grizzly Mark ability. This is a 2 AP action that places down a token within this operative's control range. Whenever an enemy operative is within 3 inches of the Grizzly marker, your opponent must spend 1 additional AP for that operative to perform the pickup, marker, or mission actions. Also, when determining control of a marker, treat the total APL stat of enemy operatives that contest that marker as 1 lower, which is cumulative with other APL changes. Note that this action can only be performed once per battle, but strategic placement can really break the action economy imbalance of the team wide open. Depending on the board layout, it's often possible to position the Shrive Talon so that they can reach the mid-board objective with a reposition and a dash. If this is the case, you can select the reposition as your scouting option, move the Shrive Talon 3 inches up the board, and have them positioned to be in range to reposition and drop the Grizzly Mark to cover that whole objective in the first turning point. If you're able to set this up, it can really distort your opponent's ability to even contest that mid-board objective, oftentimes derailing their game plan entirely with the action economy imbalance. Not all missions are going to call for objective control like this, and not all board layouts are going to make it possible to abuse in this way, but if either of those situations arise, you should definitely consider setting this up to unseat your opponent's strategy. Finally, the standard Legionary Warrior operative has 2 loadout options. It has a long-range bolt gun with fists, and a close-range chainsword and pistol variant. This is 99% of the time going to be taken to add another chainsword to the squad, which, combined with the Mark of Khorne like we talked about, brings another 5/6 weapon with 5 attacks to the table. Plus, their ability Infernal Pact allows you to swap their assigned Mark of Chaos once per game, which, although it seems like it's minor, can allow you to swap to some devastating shooting or equally powerful melee if you need to change it up. Oftentimes, you'll keep the same Mark of Chaos for the first 2 turning points, and then you'll swap in the 3rd turning point if the game state has changed and you need to adjust. This can be very important as a tool to keep the pressure up, but the primary reason you're taking this operative is to get another powerful melee piece onto the board. With the operatives in the back of our mind, we can now take a look at the strategic and firefight ploys available to the team. Just a reminder, each of these ploys is going to have an effect that applies to everyone on the team, and a secondary effect that only applies to operatives with the corresponding Mark of Chaos. Blood for the Blood God is the Khorne strategy ploy, which grants all operatives who don't have the Mark of Khorne 1 additional damage the first time that they strike with a hit of any kind in melee combat that they start. If an operative has the Mark of Khorne, however, they instead get a +1 damage buff to both their normal and critical strikes for all of their melee weapons, regardless if they're fighting or retaliating. As we've already discussed in the video, this can be really important for certain damage breakpoints against various enemy types, so don't be afraid to take melee operatives and slap this mark on them so that they can go do their job. Implacable is the strategy ploy for Nurgle, which allows all operatives to ignore any changes to their stats as a result of being injured, including their weapon stats. If an operative has the Mark of Nurgle, they treat enemy shooting attacks with Piercing 1 as having Piercing Crits 1 instead. This can help mitigate the armor-piercing punch that a lot of operatives and a lot of teams have nowadays, but critically it doesn't do anything against Piercing 2 weapons. Also, before you take this mark on all of your important units, make sure that your opponent can't cheat a critical hit into their shooting. Many teams also have a way to do this, which effectively makes this mark's rule for Nurgle operatives useless. Quicksilver Speed is the Slanesh strategy ploy, granting all friendly Legionary operatives a special debuff to enemy operatives in melee. If a friendly Legionary operative has performed an action in which it moved during the turning point, worsen the hit stat of the enemy operative's melee weapons by 1 when this operative is fighting. This has been toned down since the beginning of the edition, but it still offers a powerful debuff when they are the ones that are charging into the opponents and fighting them. Just remember that it only applies to operatives that have moved during the turning point and only applies when they're the ones that are starting the fight. The other half of Quicksilver Speed is that whenever an operative is shooting a friendly Legionary Slaanesh operative more than 6 inches away from it, and that Slaanesh operative has performed an action during this turning point in which it is moved, worsen the hit stat of that enemy operative's weapons by 1. In all cases, neither of these debuffs are cumulative with being injured. Again, there is some setup required for the second half of this ploy, but it can make it really hard to push through damage at a safe range. The workaround for this ploy is to get within 6 and shoot the relevant operative, but these operatives are the ones that want to get close to you anyway so that they can close the gap in shred in melee. So it can create kind of a tough puzzle for your opponent. The final strategic ploy is the Tzeentch ploy, Fickle Fates. Whenever a friendly Legionary operative is shooting at a ready enemy operative, that friendly operative's ranged weapons have the Ceaseless Weapon rule, unless they already do, like the Reaper Chain Cannon, in which case they gain the Relentless Weapon rule instead. Obviously, this is a powerful opening ploy in a turning point that you know you're going to be going first and you want to start off with some superpowered shooting. The second half is sort of the reverse of the first half. Whenever an operative is shooting against a ready friendly Tzeentch operative, in the roll defense dice step, if you retain any critical successes, you can retain one of your fails as a normal success instead of discarding it. I've rarely seen this side of the ploy come up, but it does add a nice defensive buff against shooting if you know that you're going to catch some heat during the round. Just remember that the defensive buff is only for Tzeentch operatives, so you have to make sure that you know where your opponent is going to be shooting at to get value out of the second part. The first part of the ploy is primarily what I've been using this for. Moving on to Firefight ploys, we have the Khorne ploy up first. Unending Bloodshed is used when a friendly Legionary Khorne operative is fighting or retaliating and is incapacitated. You can strike the enemy operative that they are fighting in that sequence with one of your unresolved successes before the friendly operative is removed from the kill zone. This can be a nice way to ensure that your enemy goes down with you, and it can also be a way to prevent them from getting a free finisher onto a heavily wounded operative. Mutability and Change is the Tzeentch Firefight ploy, which is declared when a friendly Legionary Tzeentch operative is activated. Until the end of that operative's activation, add 1 to its APL stat. If it's a warrior operative, you cannot change its assigned Mark of Chaos during this turning point. This is an excellent flexible tool that can grant important operatives a bonus action if or when it becomes relevant. You can use this to perform a mission action on an objective, to reposition and dash and still perform 2 shoot actions, or to outcompete enemy operatives with a higher APL count for contesting an objective. It's a really flexible tool, so make sure you're considering this when you're trying to maximize your action economy. The Nurgle Firefight ploy is Malignant Aura, which can be used when a friendly Legionary Nurgle operative is performing the shoot action and you're selecting a valid target. Until the end of that action, whenever that friendly operative is within 3 inches of it, the friendly operative's ranged weapons have the Piercing 1 weapon rule. This is a nice way to cheat in some armor piercing, but it feels bad that there only applies to one shooting action. It does specifically say that it applies to targets hit by any relevant blast, as long as they are also within 3 inches as well. So that's probably the best way to utilize this. I could see a scenario using the Balefire Acolyte against a group of enemies where this could get some nasty value. The final Firefight ploy is the Slaanesh ploy, Sickening Captivation. This ploy is effectively an on-demand version of the Shrive Talon's ability, Horrifying Dismemberment. With this ploy, you declare it during a friendly Legionary Slaanesh operative's activation, before or after it performs an action. Select one enemy operative visible to and within 4 inches of the friendly operative. Until the end of the enemy operative's next activation, subtract 1 from its APL stat. Note that you can't modify an APL stat by more than plus or minus 1 at a time, but this is a way to get this debuff working somewhere other than just the Shrive Talon, and it doesn't require you to kill them. It can also be a sneaky way to claim control of an objective without actually killing your opponent off the point. The Chaos Legionaries were the first box set elite team introduced into the game in Kill Team 2nd Edition, and they have remained a popular choice for players of all types. They have some amazing customization and kit bash options, they've always been a solid team to play, and they have been around long enough that they're pretty easy to get your hands on. They play pretty much the same way that they did previously. They're a small squad of elite super soldier space marines, each one acting like a hero on the battlefield as they take out multiple enemies or fell mighty opponents by themselves. This can give players a real sense that their operatives are all meaningful on the table, and that the low operative count can help newer players develop their fundamentals for the game like positioning and resource management. Their ploys are straightforward and thematic, but that doesn't mean that they're not important or impactful. I do think this team is a good starter team, but experienced players will also be able to wield this team to devastating effect because of the strengths that the team has. In many cases, this team is just able to put better operatives on the table than their opponent, which immediately creates a scenario where the opponent is, quote, playing from behind before dice are even rolled or operatives are set up on the board. Like I just mentioned, this team can kind of just stat check opposing teams, which is probably their main strength. Not all teams can play into super durable killing machine elites the same way, so opponents that are unfamiliar with the matchup will likely struggle to execute on their game plans. Examples of this are moves like that Shrive Talon opener or the Anointed Spear Tip move that we talked about already in the video. Powerful opening gambits like those are telegraphed, sure, but knowing what is coming is only half the battle. Your opponent also needs to have the right pieces in place to stop those gambits, and the back and forth between you and your opponent with respect to those moves is a sort of mini-game inside the game that will determine elements of board control. I don't have a lot of individual tricks or synergies to describe in this section like I usually do, because that's not really how this team functions. Instead, this team primarily rewards whichever player has done their homework with respect to scenarios that arise in the game. Recognizing how your opponent is planning to deal with your gambits will help you to better position them. Eventually, you'll know whether or not an opponent's setup will be able to handle what you're going to throw at them, which will increase your knowledge and skill as a player. In general, I see Chaos Legionary lists as falling into one of three categories: Khorne/Slaanesh heavy melee focused builds, Tzeentch heavy shooting focused builds, and mixed builds. Melee heavy builds center around adding the Mark of Khorne to melee operatives, often to hit that 5-6 damage threshold, or adding the Mark of Slaanesh to throw a wrench into the reliability of enemy melee and create one-sided charge scenarios with that 1 extra inch of movement. Shooting builds take operatives like the Gunner and sometimes the Heavy Gunner, paired with Tzeentch Tainted Bolt Pistols for lots of reliable crits at range, which can help them trade more favorably against enemy elite teams that would otherwise wear down this team in melee. The mixed lists are teams that fall somewhere in the middle of that, often taking 3 operatives with one mark and 3 operatives with a different one. These lists can cover all of your bases and allow you to flex in between what works best at the time, but their drawback is that they can be kind of command point hungry and sometimes don't have enough redundancy if your opponent is able to deal with the one operative that does a particular task for your squad. Definitely experiment with which type of build you as a player prefer. It also might change for different matchups, so if you're having a hard time with something specific, try mixing it up and seeing how it feels. If we're going to be talking Tac Ops, the Chaos Legionaries have access to both security and seek and destroy. Oddly enough, both of these categories have some play for the team, but just like the Marks of Chaos, they're going to be changed based on what your opponent is across the table and the board that you're playing on. Security has appealing options in the form of Take Ground and Contain. Take Ground definitely requires you to look at the game board and determine if you're going to easily be able to reach and hold those relevant pieces of heavy terrain in the midboard, and not all boards are created equal with respect to this. Also consider which side of the board you're on, because again, they're not necessarily equal with respect to the viability of Take Ground. Contain is another great option, especially if you think it'll be hard for your opponent to get their models onto your side of the board. As a hyper-killy elite team, most enemy teams are going to have a lot of a struggle just getting past your operatives, let alone surviving with those guys long enough to make it to the end of the turning point. For Seek and Destroy, Champion actually has some play in elite mirror matches, since you can select who you're going to be starting the violence off with each round, but usually I opt for Contain for the reasons that we just mentioned. Especially in the elite mirror, it can be really hard for your opponent to push past you simply because your operatives are so dangerous. I've received a number of requests to talk about equipment in these guide videos, so I'll start including some brief thoughts on those now too. Warded armor is amazing and an auto take into everything except for mandrakes, I think, since it doesn't actually work against them. Having the ability to select an operative every turning point and give them a 2-up armor save can really brick wall your opponent and protect key operatives of yours. Tainted rounds can generally be pretty good, but unless you have the Mark of Tzeentch on someone that's using this, it can fall kind of flat. It's a good option if you have a warrior who was Khorne and now needs to be Tzeentch, but keep that in mind. You can effectively have a second copy of your leader's shooting profile with this equipment though, which Although it requires some resource dedication, it can be really powerful. Chaos Talismans are like a worse version of Space Marine Purity Seals. You can deal D3 damage to yourself to convert an offensive fail into a normal success if you roll 2 or more fails. It also has to be declared each turning point as to which of the marks this is going to apply for in the turning point, which is another point for it being worse than Purity Seals. You'll still probably take this, but you'll have to think harder about where to use them in a given turning point, and you won't always predict correctly. Malefic Blades are actually really good as a safeguarding option for your shooting-oriented operatives, since it upgrades their melee profiles to having 5 attacks. Even though the damage output isn't great, it means that they'll have plenty of attacks to parry out against enemy melee specialists that get close to them. I pretty much always take these, but I don't always need them. This team has pretty good faction equipment pieces, so I usually take all 4 of those, but I will consider barricades if we're on ITD maps, heavy barricades included in that, or occasionally smoke grenades or ladders. In KT-24, the Chaos Legionaries are a bread-and-butter elite team that brings a squad of experts to the table to solve their problems. Each specialist operative has a unique feel to them and is plenty capable of doing their assigned job. Players of all skill levels will find that they have something to learn from this team, from honing and focusing the fundamentals to understanding complicated combat math for 2 particular operatives. Especially for members of the community that are driven by hobby potential, this kill team has only a few models necessary, so you can really pour your heart and soul into each one and make them customized pieces to you. At some point, everyone who plays this game will eventually find themselves in a game involving the Chaos Legionaries, so hopefully now you are better prepared regardless of which side of that game you are on. That'll wrap up our introduction to the Chaos Legionaries team in KT 2024. If you have made it this far into the video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel so that you don't miss out on our future guides as well. I know the Chaos Legionaries can create a pretty divided discussion online, so if you have any tricks or gotchas that you like to use, please leave them in the comments section so that others can try them out as well. More guides like this one are coming out, so stay tuned and let me hear your requests. Until next time, have fun and be good if you want to.